In 2004 and 2006, and it was undersown with this pasture in 2006. It then had a compost tea with molly in the tea in 2008, and then it had a compost spread on it in 2010, and that's what you see here today is what it is now. So it was a completely mixed pasture of Phalaris, lucerne, cocksfoot and subclovers. We work under a rotational grazing system, so we don't actually try and leave stock in the paddock except for when they're lambing. We leave them only in short periods. But what's really pleased me with this paddock is the lack of weeds in the paddock now, and the diversity of the pasture still after 6 years. So 6 years is a fair while to have a paddock under a pasture situation without getting some issues with weed pressure or imbalance. So I will hand this to Hugh and let Hugh make some observations and comments.
Bill, are the cattle coming here at any time, or is the grazing only sheep?
I do trade some cattle at times, but in that time it probably would have been back in... Yeah, so it was back probably, they have been cattle across this country, but predominantly sheep in this country at this moment, yep. There was compost tea in 08 with Molly, and then there was compost in here in 010. And I will definitely be putting another compost spread probably on this next season.
What rate, like
about a tonne to the hectare. And probably that works out to approximately 700 or 800 kilos of compost plus some minerals. Yeah, it will this next time, I think, depending on the soil test. Yep.
When will you bring this back to the cropping phase?
Wow. With a pasture like this, I'm very, very hesitant to bring it into cropping.
No, you said you know.
Yeah, I would normally run it. It would normally be run out now, and I would bring it back in. But what I'm seeing is that we are noticing on our farm now that our pastures are just hanging on a lot longer. And so I've got country like that big paddock out the far side of the place there with the trees on top of the hill there. That'll probably come into crop next season now. And we've started the regime of bringing like a canola in the first year into crop, and the canola the last year to undersow to. And I'm hoping we can just run by a paddock this year that we've got up the road here, just around the place that's got undersown pasture under canola. And I think you'd be quite amazed how much pasture how well it does under canola.
Bill, does that canola phase knock your BAMs about, or is because there's enough hard seed stuff there's enough other plants other than canola to
I think it seems to be the diversity that seems to carry it through. If we were growing canolas that were using a lot of heavy chemical under them, maybe there'd be a real issue. But we're growing canola that, like I grow garnet in that pasture phase of sowing, so that there's been nothing else on there but a little bit of knockdown grass herbicide. That's the only thing that's gone on it. So very little. The other crop of canola we've had very good results with is a variety called Y83, because you can graze it and you can sow it early. That's my neighbour's paddock there. We're only coming to bead on the way down just then. That was actually grazed into the ground in July, and that just shows you the power of Y83 variety. It's just unbelievable. My son James, where we'll go tomorrow, we'll actually see a paddock there that he's got in cereal crop this year that was under canola last year, and a Y83, and he grazed it, into the dirt in July, and it yielded 3 tonne to the hectare. So it's quite an amazing variety. I'll hand over to Hugh.
Bill, can I just ask one question about, you were talking about your rotational grazing,
Yep.
your composting and all the rest of it.
Yes.
When you're looking at your objectives of building soil, where do you get the biggest bang for your buck? Your rotational grazing or your composting, or?
Your combination.
Yeah.
This is carbon dumping, because you've got, top mirrors bottom, and we're not grazing this into the ground at any time. We actually cut, and you can't see it from here, but the other side of this paddock we actually cut last year for stuff to go into the compost, and the lucerne was 18 inches high. So I think the trick is don't graze it too far down, and that extra humus mixed within the compost system just keeps that biological activity so active. And I think that's where we're getting our benefits in these pastures.
Okay.
No, just hang on.
Yeah. I'll stick it in here and clip it to my collar maybe, and I'll have my hands free. Okay. One of the things I look for when I walk into a pasture, of course, is I look at the diversity. And I see a lot of things here that might be considered weeds. I see, for instance, right, where was it? Right here by my foot, I see a little Patterson's curse. And it's a really good source of copper for your animals. And there's so little of it in here that they're going to nip this for the copper and never get copper toxic on it because there's so much else for them to eat. It's not a problem weed. It should never be a problem weed. Where patos is a problem weed is where you've herbicided and killed everything else but it. When it sprouts just in its first cotyledons, its roots are already down about this deep, and it chases the copper. And by the time it's flowering, then it's got its taproot down there so far down that it can bring up the copper, and on a copper toxic paddock, it'll kill your sheep from copper poisoning if they don't have anything else to eat and they eat too much of it. I looked at both lucerne and clover. I cut them off so I didn't pinch them, and they're solid stem, absolutely solid. Could pass that around a little bit. And that's a sign of boron sufficiency in the paddock. There's enough boron in there that the plant is able to transport its sap at a pretty near optimal level. And I think that's, I mean, I really see a lot of boron deficiency in paddocks, pastures, and that also translates into poor growth, poor nitrogen fixation, because if the plant doesn't take up sap, then it doesn't let down root exudates either. So if you're testing like a paddock and you see, you can take your Brix meter out, you take your Brix meter out and measure it at 6 o'clock in the morning, and it's got high Brix, the Brix is 10 maybe or something like that, you know it didn't let its sugars down to the roots the night before, and so it's boron deficient. It never got enough moisture up there in the plant the previous day in order to let its sugars down at night. It's still got its sugars in the leaf in the early morning. And that's not a condition that feeds the soil or its nitrogen-fixing microbes. And I think that nitrogen, when you consider that there's 3/4 of a ton of nitrogen over every square foot of soil in the atmosphere. It's just sitting there. And if our soil's open and it breathes, it can get into the soil. And it should be fixed by the soil's microbes if they only have enough energy to do it.
And if they're alive.
Yeah, well, if they're alive, if there are some there. And
nitrogen for 10 years.
It shouldn't have to have. Pasture should be fixing all its own nitrogen. When you consider how fertile some of these soils have been without any inputs from humans, and then we came along and started farming them and didn't need fertilizer. Where's Cam? Didn't need fertilizer when you first started cropping them, and they grew terrific crops.
Haven't grown crops like it since.
Yeah, that's right. Hadn't done that since. But it became fertile due to nature, and the nitrogen didn't get put on from a bag or from a fertilizer plant or anything like that. It came out of the atmosphere. And really, that's where we should be getting virtually all our nitrogen. Any nitrogen we have to put in order to grow a top crop ought to be considered a remedy for a soil that's not working well enough yet. So, and that boron deficiency, you see it a lot more in legumes because they have a much higher requirement for boron. Anytime you see a plant with a transport system like this, all of those leaf veins, those channels for transportation in the plant, are straight. This is like having an irrigation system that has one sprinkler head out on the end. It doesn't take much pressure to operate it. But if you've got something like a clover leaf, you look at its transport system and it's all branched. It's like having an irrigation system with 20 sprinkler heads on it. It takes a lot more pressure to run the system. Now, boron replaces borate replaces some of the silicate in the lining of the transport vessels, and it creates an electron hunger in those vessels, and that pulls the water and electrolytes up in the plant. And that's what gives you sap pressure. If you don't have boron in that lining of your capillaries, then you don't get much sap pressure. It's actually sap suction. And so when you're looking at this, you're going to have for that legume, you're going to have 4 or 5 times the amount of boron available to it as you have for your grasses or your cereals. So it's a question. When you go into a paddock and you look to see, do I have enough boron there? Check your legumes. Check your canola even. It's got about 3 or 4 times the amount of boron requirement as wheat. And when Martin was pointing out these farmers in Holland were planting canola as a catch crop to catch the nitrogen, they were also catching the boron. And boron's so easily leached. You don't need much, but boy, you need it. And it's so easily leached that it's probably just as important that they caught the boron as if they caught the nitrogen.
I've got a question. Last year, where we had canola crops, because I believe canola was well named when it was raped, because it raped the nitrogen and sulfur. But in our canola crops, the nitrate, if you looked at the soil test from Rocky South, the nitrate nitrogen was really high. So why was that after canola?
After canola, because it had so much nitrogen in it, if that broke down and it was still in the bacterial stage, then it would show up high nitrate before it became humified. So you have to consider on your soil testing that nitrate is one of those things that can go way up and go way down real fast. So it's one of the least indicative measures on your soil test. Oh, it indicates what the current condition was when you took the soil test, but it doesn't tell you the story down the track. And what you have to look at, if you do a total test, then you look at the total nitrogen in the soil. You might have only 2 parts per million nitrate in the soil and have 2,000 or 3,000 parts per million of nitrogen in the total test. That's 1,000 times more nitrogen in the soil than shows up as nitrate in the test. And it's that nitrogen to calcium ratio in the soil, or calcium to nitrogen ratio in the soil, that you're aiming at in your total test as a target of about 10 to 1, or maybe slightly less. And self-fertile soils all seem to have that ratio of carbon to nitrogen in them. And you're shooting for this or a little bit richer ratio in your compost as well. You have a 15 to 1 carbon to nitrogen ratio in your compost, you do not have good compost. You have compost that's going to be hungry and scavenge the nitrogen in your soil. So that's a big story, the nitrogen story. It's the one thing we shouldn't have to buy on these paddocks. There may be any number of other things that we're not going to get out of the atmosphere. We may not get enough sulfur or phosphorus, though we'll get some out of the atmosphere. But we should be able to get all our nitrogen out of the atmosphere. And if we get our reserves of sulfur and phosphorus built up in the soil, we won't need to get any particularly high amount out of the atmosphere, but we'll have to build it until we get there. So that's something to think about. Now, okay, so we've got a lot of witchetty grubs here and other sorts of
Just out of that one
grubs in
spot
the
there.
soil. These are not what I'm looking at as really beneficial soil animal lives.
It's just the activity that's in under the root system.
Yeah, they do tunnel and aerate the soil and all those things. And you might have brought your probe here to see what that's like. Now,
Most worms seem to be down just a fraction deeper. I'd say that's just moisture.
Now I want to see what the soil looks like in this part here that's been eaten down and is relatively bare compared to what's on this clump of grass. And I might say that when we graze off or cut off or harvest in any sort of way, we cut the top off, then there's dieback in the root zone. So on dairy pastures where they're grazing something that's a shallow rooted grass to begin with, like perennial rye, they graze it every 15 days. It never has a chance for the roots to get down deeper than just 2 or 3 inches. And where you've got it grow out and top out like this, then you're going to be able to develop maximum root depth in your paddock. So this is going to have a deeper root depth, I guess, on this part here that's in the clump than what's outside of it.
And then the fish feeding of the dry grass on dairy farms, the modern dairy farm, like 2, this time of the year, 2 is normal.
Yeah, it's hard to get it above that. And you can. But it's going to take a little bit better management and understanding of the soil biology, not just the soil minerals.
The bricks on that there where we just tested them was 12.5.
Now I'm kind of bashing this to get it to turn loose so that I can see what the roots look like without stripping the biology off of them completely. Now, as I conjectured, the only really deep roots in the soil were underneath the grass clump. See that? I broke them off. I didn't get there. I didn't see how deep they went, but they went.
How much deeper would the finer ones go than that? Would they go another foot or so? More, probably?
Well, you can see here in this portion, there's fine roots that, not quite so many of them, but there's fine roots that went down there at least 4 or 5 inches deep. So you got 10 or 15 centimeters, and over here you've got more like 6 or 8 maybe maximum. And you look at the fuzziness on the root, look at the soil adhesion. Even on this big old root, there's soil adhesion. It's pretty good. Here's another measure of boron. You look at your grassy roots and their stretchiness, whether they stretch without breaking or not, that's a measure of boron sufficiency as well. So you test these things and it's hard to break them and they stretch before they break. That shows you your boron deficiency in grasses. If they're brittle, then and they're not resilient, see, then they're boron deficient. And there's a lot of different indications. One of the things you'll notice in clovers, this might not be a good example of it because this clover leaf and most of the clover leaves I see out here are fairly normal sized. Now they can get bigger, But if they're dwarf, especially in the winter, then you're zinc deficient. And I was looking at the wheat over in this other paddock and thinking, because zinc is working at the boundaries of the leaf, and thinking that, oh, on the wheat, the tips of the leaves looked like they burned off, and there wasn't enough indication that that was potash deficiency by the yellowing of the lower leaves. If the plant is really potash deficient, it robs its lower leaves and they turn yellow and straw and they die. And that would happen before the tips of the newer leaves. So I would guess there's still, I set higher targets for things like zinc and copper and manganese and whatnot than most people do, because I think that wheat still was limited by the amount of zinc is taken up. And I think that on a tissue test that I would want to see a higher level of zinc in that particular wheat, and it would be more resistant. Oh.
Soil test is only 2.2.
Oh, see? And I would be looking on that soil test to get it up there, gradually, up to where it's 10 parts per million in the soil before I know I'm not going to show any zinc deficiency in the crop. So those are things to consider too.
We actually sprayed zinc on years ago on triticale, and you could see it change colour in a day. So yeah, it's very noticeable zinc deficiency.
Now we apply it in the blend.
Yep.
As well as down the tube.
Yeah, we do it differently.
Yeah, on canola, you'll see zinc deficiency. The boundary of the canola leaf seems like it's a little constricted and it sort of cups a little bit. And that's a sign of zinc deficiency in canola. So it stunts the leaf, but it's stunting it from the boundary, and the leaf can still expand somewhat in the middle of the leaf, so it cups. That doesn't show up the same way in clover. It just restricts the size of the leaf altogether. But these are things that you can see with your eye, and you can estimate just how things are going, even without, like, doing a soil test. Not that I'm in any way discouraging people from doing soil tests, but I'll say this. I was looking here a couple months ago at a soil test done by Assssment. This was over in Western Victoria. And they thought that 0.2 of a part per million on their range for zinc, that was adequate.
No, they say adequate.
And I wouldn't have thought it adequate at any less than 2 parts per million. But they were 1/10 as much zinc they considered adequate. Now they're selling nitrogen, and people put the nitrogen on, then it crashes a little bit more of the humic reserve and releases a little of the zinc that's tied up there, and you get a zinc response from the nitrogen, but it hasn't actually cured the problem. So Assssment, by setting that low level, is probably selling nitrogen fertilizer. And why would they change? But if you're going to go biological, you're going down the road of reducing your inputs insofar as possible and as much as possible to get it as close as possible to zero. And yeah, it takes a while. This is not going to happen overnight. But if you had these luxury levels of these trace elements, then I reckon you'd do a better job of photosynthesis. The plant's chemistry would work much better, particularly in cold weather, where, look, at 0 degrees it works 1/10 as well as at 10 degrees. But at 10 degrees it works 1/10 as well as it does at 20 degrees. So at 0 degrees it's working 100th as well as it does at 20 degrees. So your deficiencies really show up in the winter. And yes, in the spring, and it warms up, and you're out of the woods again, and it looks like what you've got is enough. But if you look what happens, particularly on things like dairy pastures in the winter, that really tells you whether you have enough of things or not. So, and because dairy pasture, the grasses are producing food for the very microorganisms that humify, that create humic acids and build reserves in the soil, then you can build pasture, dairy pasture particularly, because you have a little bit of money you can spend on it. You can build pasture organic matter levels. Commonly, anything I see over 10% organic matter soil tests is pasture. Not always dairy pasture, but it is pasture. And it's grass that built that high level of organic matter in the soil. It doesn't happen in forests nearly so easily as it does in grassland. That's why all of your world's most fertile soils with the greatest humus flywheel are all grassland soils.
And that's
So-
the example I gave about the green manure, like oats in a green manure, like oats, vetch, and a grass with a legume to get the carbon and the nitrogen. Like oats is a very efficient carbon pump in the soil. And like oats in Europe have the nickname kiss for the soil. So it comes from the ages in the past that they saw that oats had a special meaning for soil. So what the oats plant does, it pumps carbon in the soil. And there's such a fibrous root system that it has all these microbes in that fibrous root system feeding them, and they convert all that carbon into humus, and it's a pump for the future. And then talking about weeds, like in a pasture, like there are no weeds, and like if there's no weed, that means that animals can eat everything. And like in cropping, we call something a weed if it competes with our plants, but like a weed seed only emerges in the soil it likes. And it's absolutely amazing that a wheat seed, like when I came here 30 years ago, you hardly saw onion grass in the Riverina. Now there's far more onion grass in Riverina. And onion grass is a symptom of degraded soils. Because you can go home and you can look at the grasses as an example in your property. Like the earlier a grass flowers after emergence, the more primitive it is. And like onion grass flowers very quickly. And those plants that flower quickly thrive on poor fertility because they have to grow and flower, set seed before there's no more dough. So if the soil goes down like low carbon and low soil fertility, you get more of the primitive grasses. Then as you start biological farming and you increase the carbon in the soil, you increase the biological activity, then the onion grass drops off, the barley grass drops off, and you get like in the Central West where I gave a talk, a guy, I had a victory, I had wild oats back. Because wild oats are like a higher order weed that didn't grow anymore on his property.
Yeah.
So that's how we can learn. And then in the grazing systems, another good feedback was, like a grazier leased a block of land and put the cattle in there with rotational grazing, and they walked around the mustard and the sorrel and the dock, while on his home property they were eating it. Now, that property that he leased was always fertilized with single super, etc. And then, of course, if you then come back to the picture of like our water-soluble fertilizers, that if we put our water-soluble fertilizers, the fertilizer you can buy in the bag, the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, if you put them on the soil, then it's water-soluble, the plants can suck it up and take it up and grow. So you get this growth spurt of plants and they don't pick up all the other minerals. So the plants become unbalanced. And animals don't like that stuff, so they leave it behind. And then the science world was measuring all those weeds and said, oh, it's low efficiency and low, what words do you use for grass? Low energy and all that stuff. Poor digestibility. And so this is a weed, you have to kill them, never let them grow. But that was already in the time that single super was used. So all those weeds that were measured and not good for animals was all fed with single super in the paddocks that they were growing, and the animals can't digest it. But now if we grow those plants in a good biological system, then they grow the way they want to grow and animals can digest those plants so they eat them. And as they eat them and you improve the carbon in the soil, those plants suddenly don't grow anymore because it's not their environment anymore.
Here's another reason they don't grow. The reason that you don't see very much paddoes in this paddock is the sheep have grazed it. They've eaten it because It's candy to them. It's like a little bit of salt and pepper on their food. It's seasoning. And those weeds aren't going to thrive all that well because they're getting eaten. You know, they're valuable to the animals.
Yeah, and that's the high diversity. Like the higher the diversity, the more choice the animals have, and the less problems you will get with a dominant weed.
Yeah, I think that's the key to these pastures is diversity. You know, if you can get that diversity in, it makes a huge difference to how they perform.
And they can free choice their copper, and that's going to translate into wool quality. And what's your wool quality here again? What was that?
It was 100% above 30.
100% above 30.
Some of
They're getting
the
their
tests
copper.
this year have come around about 48, 49. So
Yep.